the twilight of old empires, when the Seljuks had cracked and the Mongols roared across the steppes like thunder, Anatolia was no longer a land of kings. It was a graveyard of kingdoms. From the burning palaces of Persia to the crumbling walls of Baghdad, the world that had once thrived under caliphs and sultans was now scattered to the winds. But in the wreckage of shattered dynasties, something stirred, quietly, like the rustle of leaves before the storm. Out of the frontier lands between Byzantium and Islam, between the dying embers of old orders and the unknown dawn of new ones, came a man named Osman. Not a king, not a prophet, just a warrior with a vision, born of dirt and faith, blade and prayer. He would never know the full shape of what he had started. His name would echo through halls he'd never see, across lands he'd never touch. But it was his breath that sparked the flame. Osman was the son of Ertuğrul, leader of a small Turkic tribe that had settled in the region of Sugid, pushed westward by the Mongol tempest. These were no soft nobles. They were Ghassis, frontier warriors, raiders of Rome, guardians of Islam's western edge. They lived in the wild zones where maps blurred and empires met with swords. Their world was forged in constant war, against Christian Byzantines to the west, against rival Turkic tribes to the east. And yet, amid chaos came a strange order, an identity. There is an old story, perhaps myth, perhaps truth, of a dream Osman had one night, sleeping in the home of a holy man named Sheikh Edebali. In the dream, a moon rose from Edebali's chest and entered Osman's. From his own chest grew a tree, vast and mighty, its branches stretching across the world. Beneath it flowed rivers and domes and cities, and around it gathered people of every tongue and robe. When Osman awoke, he married the Sheikh's daughter, and from that marriage, of blood and dream, sword and scripture, came a dynasty that would last over 600 years. At first, it was small, a raid here, a skirmish there. The Byzantines were fractured, no longer the power they once were. The old Roman Empire, Christian and tired, had lost its grip on Anatolia. Its cities were hollowed, its walls more symbolic than strong. Osman's forces began to nibble at the edges, capturing forts, converting churches to mosques, absorbing the rhythms of the land. What made the early Ottomans powerful was not just their military might. It was their ability to adapt, to incorporate Christian peasants into their system, to borrow the legal styles of the Persians, the tactics of the Mongols, the mysticism of the Sufis. They were not merely conquerors, they were absorbers. Where others burned what they could not control, the Ottomans restructured it. Theirs was a patient conquest, slow and systemic, a spider spinning a web, strand by strand. The early Ottoman state had no glittering palace, no massive treasury, no imperial bureaucracy. It was mobile, tribal, and Islamic to its marrow. The leadership rotated through councils of warriors and elders. The caliphate, weakened and distant, gave legitimacy a name, but the sword was what carved the real titles. And yet, what they built lasted. Osman was succeeded by his son Orhan, who captured Bursa, a jewel of a city that became the first true Ottoman capital. The conquest of Bursa in 1326 was not just military victory, it was institutional birth. There began the first coins, the first state records, the first stirrings of something deeper than a tribe and empire. From here, the Ottoman banner grew bolder. Their method was relentless but measured. They did not rush blindly into greatness, they studied it. They surrounded cities for years, cutting off trade, starving loyalty. They married their enemies. They promised peace and honored it, until they didn't. Like the shifting of tectonic plates, their rise was quiet until it was impossible to ignore. To the west, Byzantium trembled. Its emperors, though draped in velvet and crosses, knew that time was against them. The Empire of Rome had lasted 1,000 years, but the torch was dimming, and at the edge of that firelight stood the Ottomans, young, hungry, and waiting. But before they could take the great city of cities, Constantinople, they would need to grow stronger, wiser, and more united. That moment would come. But first, the seed needed to take root. The Ottomans were no accident. They were born of ruin, yes, but shaped by vision. They were a bridge between the sacred and the strategic, between the nomadic past and the imperial future. In every stone laid, in every prayer whispered before battle, there was a sense, not just of conquest, but of purpose. And so the ashes of empires became the soil for something new. A flame caught in Anatolia, and the world would never be the same again. With Bursa now under the Ottoman banner, the winds began to shift. No longer were they just a wandering warrior band. This was now a state with roots, with gold stamped in its name, with judges issuing decrees in markets where Arabic and Greek and Turkish were all heard in the same breath. Orhan Ghazi, son of Osman, proved not merely a fighter, but a builder. He understood that swords win land, but systems keep it. He founded mosques, schools, and the earliest versions of what would become the famed Ottoman administrative machine. And he did something else, something brilliant. He introduced coinage, stamped not in Arabic script alone, but in a vision of permanence. The Ottomans would not just pass through history. They would write their name into its spine. Orhan's era marked the first use of the title, Sultan. And yet their modest court still wandered, far from the later palatial might of Istanbul. Their capital was a moving creature, Bursa, then Idin, closer to the Balkans, to the pulse of Europe. With every conquest, the Ottomans shed a layer of tribal skin and grew something new. An empire in embryo, but with growth came hunger. To the west, the Byzantines, still seated in Constantinople, had become a fading echo. The city still stood, proud walled, drenched in holy icons, but outside its gates, the empire was a patchwork of desperate alliances. Civil wars had turned emperors into beggars. Some even invited Ottoman forces to settle disputes, trading land for temporary peace. And so, unknowingly, the Byzantines paved the path of their own conquerors. Enter Murad I, Orhan's son. Under his reign, the Ottomans crossed the Dardanelles and surged into the Balkans, marking the true beginning of their European phase. He didn't just fight, he transformed. Murad established the Devshirme system, the controversial but effective method of gathering Christian boys from the empire's European lands, converting them to Islam, training them in palace schools, and raising them into elite soldiers, the Janissaries. These were not mere troops. They were an institution, loyal not to tribe nor family, but to the Sultan alone. The Ottomans were not just expanding. They were evolving. Greek architects began to build their mosques. Persian poets found a home in their courts. Slavic warriors rode under their flags. It was no longer a question of conquest alone, but of assimilation. They became, like Rome before them, an empire of many faces. By the time of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the Ottomans had already stepped beyond the borderlands. They were now one of the dominant powers of Southeast Europe. The battle was bloody, the result contested, but it became a mythic moment in Balkan memory. And though Murad I died on that battlefield, assassinated as he surveyed the carnage, his legacy had already cemented the path forward. His son, Bayezid I, would inherit not just the sword, but a swelling empire. Called Y Ludarum, the thunderbolt, Bayezid would push harder, faster, expanding the reach of Ottoman armies into Hungary, Bulgaria, and deeper into Anatolia. Yet his ambition would meet its match in a figure from the east. Tamerlane, the fierce Mongol, Turkic conqueror, who would temporarily halt the Ottoman rise in the catastrophic Battle of Ankara in 1402. Bayezid was captured, and the empire was thrown into chaos. For over a decade, Ottoman princes waged civil war in what came to be known as the Ottoman interregnum, a family tearing itself apart over the broken pieces of a once stable dream. And yet it did not die. Because the Ottoman Empire was not built on the will of a single man, nor the whims of fortune. It was an evolving machine of belief, strategy, and cultural genius. Like a river redirected, but not dried, it would find its course again. And when it did, it would come back sharper than before. The ashes of empires had birthed a flame. Now the flame began to burn, and it would not flicker again until the world itself had changed. The city had stood for 1,000 years. Constantinople, queen of cities, wrapped in gold and sorrow, straddling 2 continents, crowned by domes and haunted by ghosts. The last whisper of Rome, the last breath of Byzantium, a flame flickering at the crossroads of worlds. It had survived Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, even Mongol shadows, but not time. By the mid-15th century, its empire was but a memory clinging to marble ruins. Outside its walls lay hungry armies. Inside, whispers and incense, but no answers. Then came Mehmed II. He was only 21, but in his eyes burned centuries. Son of Murad II, descendant of Osman, Mehmed was no ordinary prince. He had studied the stars and maps, read histories and hadiths, learned Latin and Persian. He was raised not just to inherit, but to complete, to fulfill a prophecy whispered for centuries, that a Muslim would take the great city of Caesar, and he believed he was that man. In 1451, Mehmed returned to the throne, and he began to prepare, not for war, but for destiny. He built a fortress on the Bosporus, Rumeli Hizarg, right across from the old Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. Locking the strait like a sword at the city's throat, he summoned cannon makers, including the Hungarian master Urban, who built him the most monstrous artillery the world had ever seen. A gun so large it could hurl stone balls the size of oxen across rivers. These were not weapons of conquest. They were hammers of fate. In the spring of 1453, the Ottoman army, numbering around 80,000 to 100,000 men, marched toward the city. With them came engineers, sappers, ships, siege towers, and Mehmed's dream. Facing him, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, with perhaps 7,000 soldiers, including Genoese mercenaries and desperate locals. The walls of Constantinople were mighty, 3 layers deep, layered in stone and legend. But walls, however thick, cannot hold against time forever. The siege began. Day and night, the great cannon roared. Its thunder shook the earth, splitting towers like fruit. But the city held. Its defenders poured boiling oil, patched walls with sandbags, prayed beneath shattered mosaics. Mehmed did not relent. He dragged ships overland, across logs greased with oil, around the great chain that guarded the Golden Horn. an engineering miracle that broke the defenders' morale. Ottoman galleys now floated where no ships had before, surrounding the city in water and flame. And still the walls stood, but inside food ran low, hope ran lower. Then, on May 29, 1453, before dawn, Mehmed gave the final order. The mosques fell silent. The drums began. The Janissaries, silent and clad in white, surged forward. Waves upon waves of men climbed the shattered stone, fell, climbed again. Cries of Allahu Akbar echoed against broken crosses. A breach opened, and the city was lost. The final assault came like a judgment summoned by centuries. May 29, 1453. The morning the world shifted. The ground trembled beneath the feet of tens of thousands of men. The wind carried the sounds of drums, war cries, and prayers. And above it all, the call to battle. Not just for land, but for legacy. For nearly 2 months, Constantinople had resisted. Its legendary walls, triple, layered, soaked in legend, lined with centuries of dust, had held back armies, crusades, and dreams. But nothing holds forever. The final Ottoman charge crashed against the weakened gate of St. Romanus. Wave after wave came, irregular as apes, followed by heavier troops. Then, finally, the elite Janissaries, white, robed and silent, trained from childhood to know no fear, to love no banner but the Sultan's. And as the city's defenders, Greeks, Italians, monks and mercenaries, fought with fire and faith, the inevitable crept closer. By sunrise, a breach. By midday, the gates opened. By sunset, the last emperor of Rome, Constantine XI Palaiologos, had vanished into legend, sword in hand, his body never found. The queen of cities had fallen. For 3 days, by the custom of conquest, Constantinople belonged to the victors. Looters poured through palaces. Churches were stripped of silver and silk. Bells melted into ingots. Icons cracked beneath spears. Smoke curled through the sky like morning banners. Yet even in conquest, something sacred hovered over the city. It was not destruction for its own sake. It was transition. On the 4th day, Mehmed Te, barely 21, entered the city not in blood-soaked triumph, but in solemn awe. He rode on horseback through the gate of Charisius, where Roman emperors had once returned from distant wars. Now, a young Muslim sultan, clothed in crimson and shadow, followed the same road. But the empire he carried was not an imitation of Rome. It was a successor. The streets were silent. What had once been the epicenter of Eastern Christendom was now subdued, waiting to be renamed, redefined. At the foot of the greatest church in Christendom, the Hagia Sophia, Mehmed dismounted. He entered the cathedral with reverence, not rage. Candles still flickered beneath the domed ceiling. A few faithful still knelt in prayer. Above him, mosaics of Christ Pantocrator gazed from golden tiles. Mehmed stooped, picked up a handful of dust from the stone floor, and whispered, "The spider weaves its web in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls from the towers of Afrasiab." It was a line of Persian poetry, a reminder that even the greatest fall. But it was also a pledge this city would not stay broken. He ordered the church converted into a mosque, Hagia Sophia Kami, not razed, not desecrated, transformed. The altar was cleared, the cross was removed, but the dome remained, the echoes remained, the sanctity redefined. He halted the looting. He summoned artisans to repair aqueducts, streets, bridges. He ordered public baths reopened, markets reorganized, and granaries restocked. He declared religious protection for Christians and Jews alike. He reinstated the Greek Patriarchate, placing it under his authority, but not abolishing it. For he knew a city ruled by fear is a city already lost. Mehmed wasn't just taking a city. He was founding a capital. He renamed it Istanbul, a name that had long floated in local tongues, derived from the Greek phrase "Ais tan Polin," to the city. Because for centuries, when people said, the city, they meant this one. Now, so would the Ottomans. But Mehmed's vision was larger than domes and roads. He dreamed of an imperial synthesis, a place where East and West did not collide, but merged. He gathered Persian theologians, Arab poets, Byzantine engineers, Jewish financiers, and Turkic generals. He opened academies, revived trade routes, and issued the Kanun, a code of laws blending Sharia with imperial order. He read Plato and Aristotle, studied Ptolemy, translated works of Euclid. He believed that knowledge was power, not just on the battlefield, but in the soul of an empire. Where once the Roman eagle had perched, now flew the crescent, not as a symbol of destruction, but of renewal. He commissioned mosques not just as places of worship, but as symbols of dominion and culture. The city's skyline would soon rise with domes and minarets, not to erase the past, but to declare a new axis of civilization. And the Hagia Sophia, once echoing with chants in Greek, now resonated with the Adhan, the call to prayer. A new chapter had begun, but it spoke in many tongues. He encouraged the return of artisans and merchants. He gave homes to Andalusian Jews, fleeing the Spanish Inquisition. He allowed Armenian and Slavic communities to flourish. He expanded the Ottoman system of millets, self-governing religious communities, granting them internal autonomy in exchange for loyalty. The genius of Mehmed was not just in conquest, but in consolidation. Where others ruled by the sword alone, he ruled by balance. To his Muslim subjects, he was the Sultan of Islam, guardian of the faith. To his Christian subjects, he was the shadow emperor of Byzantium, inheritor of Rome. To scholars, a patron. To Europe, a terrifying genius. And across the Islamic world, he was hailed as the fulfiller of prophecy. It was said that the Prophet Muhammad had promised, "You will conquer Constantinople. Its commander is the best of commanders, and his army is the best of armies." And now it had come true. But Mehmed did not stop there. His armies moved into Serbia, Morea, Wallachia, and Anatolia. He challenged the Venetians, clashed with Hungarians, and eyed Italy itself. In his lifetime, the Ottoman Empire doubled in size. But it was Istanbul that remained his masterpiece. A city of stone and soul. A place where Greek pillars held Ottoman arches, where Roman roads led to Persian courtyards, where the shadow of the prophet touched the legacy of Caesar. Under Mehmed, it became not just the capital of an empire, but the center of a world. From here, the Ottomans would rule 3 continents. From here, the caliphs would speak. From here, the pulse of empire would echo for 4 more centuries. And in the whisper of wind over its domes, one could still hear the mingled languages of faith and power: Greek, Arabic, Latin, Persian, all bowing to the crescent moon, rising from the ashes of an ancient flame. The sword may carve borders, but it is people who give empire its breath. After the conquest of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire began not just to rule, but to weave. It became a tapestry of tongues and creeds, markets and minarets, kitchens and cathedrals. It was not a place of one world, but of many, stitched together by law, fear, faith, and dream. In the 16th century, Under sultans like Bayezid Tepu and Selim I, the empire expanded rapidly. But it was under Suleiman the Magnificent that this world within worlds found its harmony. But before the palaces and domes, before the epic sieges and diplomatic treaties, there was the street. Walk through any Ottoman city, Istanbul, Cairo, Damascus, Sarajevo, or Baghdad, and you'd hear the empire breathe. The muezzin's call, in Arabic, would echo across stone courtyards, while in the alleyways below, you might hear Ladino, a Judeo, Spanish tongue spoken by Jews expelled from Spain and welcomed by the Ottomans. Further along, Greek merchants would argue over textiles, and Armenian silversmiths would chisel delicate filigree under half-light. Turkish farmers would offload fruit beside Kurdish scribes copying books in Persian. This was no illusion. It was Ottoman order. At the core of this harmony was the millet system, a genius model of confessional pluralism. Rather than force conversion or erase identities, the Ottomans recognized them. Each religious group, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others, was treated as a semi-autonomous community, a millet with its own religious leaders, schools, courts, and tax rules. The Greek Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul, the Armenian Catholicos, and the chief rabbi of the Jews were not just spiritual figures. They were political actors. They answered to the Sultan and were responsible for maintaining loyalty among their flock. In return, their traditions were largely protected. Churches rang bells. Synagogues flourished. Laws were written in the scripts of ancestors. This was not tolerance born of kindness. It was tolerance born of imperial necessity. The Ottomans ruled over lands of dizzying diversity, and so they turned potential rebellion into regulated coexistence. But religion alone did not define Ottoman identity. What truly made the empire unique was its blend of cultures across its many provinces. In Balkans, Islamic architecture met Gothic stone. In Anatolia, Turkic poetry absorbed Persian metaphors. In Arab lands, Egyptian grain flowed north to feed the palaces, while Yemeni coffee found its way into the hearts of scholars and soldiers alike. The cities were marvels of cosmopolitan design. Istanbul, the imperial capital, stood as a three-dimensional map of empire. In Fatih, madrasas taught Hanafi law beside Roman aqueducts. In Galata, Venetian merchants funded caravans to India. In Üsküdar, Sufi lodges sang poems under tiled ceilings. In Eminönü, perfume vendors passed coins to African sailors from the Red Sea. Every smell, sound, and symbol was a declaration: we are not one, we are many. And yet, there was an unmistakable Ottoman rhythm that tied it all. A sense of hierarchy, of purpose, of order. At the top, the Sultan, shadow of God on earth, defender of the faith, master of law. Below him, the viziers, the court, the judges, the military elite. But far beneath the grandeur were the people. The weavers of Bursa, the fishermen of Izmir, the shepherds of Albania, the poets of Damascus. It was they who kept the empire alive, fed, clothed, sung. Their lives were ordinary, but rich in ritual and rhythm. The week was not split by weekends, but by the call to Friday prayer. The calendar followed the lunar Islamic months, but Easter and Passover were still marked in the Christian and Jewish quarters. Beyond the armies and banners, beyond the domes that cut the skyline and the markets that bustled like rivers of voices, the Ottoman Empire lived in quieter places. In the rustle of parchment, the simmer of kitchens, the worn sandals of dervishes spinning for God. If its borders were carved by war, its soul was shaped by rhythm. In this realm of many peoples and many tongues, learning was not a privilege but a pulse. From the humblest village to the heights of Topkap Palace, knowledge was breath. Boys and girls alike, especially in cities, began their education young. They traced letters on wooden tablets with inky fingers, recited verses of the Quran beneath the shadows of olive trees, and learned the stories of prophets, poets, and kings. For the gifted and the determined, there were madrasas, great schools where logic danced with grammar, astronomy aligned with Sharia, and Aristotle found a seat beside the great imams. At the heart of this empire stood the scholars, the ulema, a class neither noble nor born into wealth, but revered for their mastery of thought. They issued fatwas, taught law, and at times stood taller than viziers, for in this world a man of knowledge could be more dangerous than one of the sword. Their ink shaped policy, their rulings guided courts, and their debates echoed across marble courtyards long after sunset. But it was not only legal minds that flourished. Another current ran beneath the stone, one softer, more intimate. It was the current of mysticism, of longing, of Sufis who saw the divine in every leaf, every breath, every silence. In the lodges of the Mevlevis, dervishes spun, not to entertain, but to remember. With arms stretched, one hand to heaven, one to earth, they became vessels of unity, echoing Rumi's words in motion rather than ink. In the rural corners of Anatolia, the Bektashis chanted with rougher voices, their rhythm more rustic, their poetry wilder, their hearts just as soft. These Sufi brotherhoods, some formal, some hidden, welcomed travellers and orphans, madmen and lovers. They offered bread, song, and a way to touch the divine not through debate, but through surrender. To them, every moment was a veil waiting to be lifted. The rustling of reeds in wind could be scripture, a rose opening at dawn, a sermon, and in the court, beauty was duty. The sultans understood that, to rule an empire of many peoples, one must build in stone what cannot be explained in words. And so they built mosques whose domes imitated the sky, fountains that wept quietly beside roads, schools where arches framed sunlight like calligraphy. The greatest of all architects was Sinan, born of Christian stock, raised in imperial schools, shaped by campaign and cathedral. His mosques did not just rise, they breathed. The Süleymanî in Istanbul, wide-shouldered and calm, stood not only as a place of worship, but as a symbol of order, proportion, and the empire's divine alignment. His Selamai in Edirne was a challenge to the world itself, a whisper that even Hagia Sophia had a successor. And within these spaces, calligraphy curled across walls and domes, verses from the Quran traced in ink so delicate it seemed to float. Artists, forbidden to draw the human form in sacred places, turned their pens to letters, making the word itself a thing of beauty. A single name, rendered with enough care, could open the heart like a prayer. Even outside the sacred, the Ottoman world was a gallery. Tilework from Iznik shimmered like crushed gemstones. Carpets from Anatolia told stories in knots. Robes carried the signs of stars and gardens, and names of God embroidered in silk. A merchant's house might be plainer than a palace, but within its walls hung the art of patience, symmetry, balance. Food, too, became its own form of devotion. The imperial kitchens of Topkapı were vast enough to feed thousands, a city within a palace. Dozens of cooks, each a master of a different dish, laboured over lambs soaked in saffron, rice steamed with cinnamon, pastries dripping with honey and rosewater, Ingredients came from the empire's every edge: grain from Egypt, figs from Aleppo, saffron from Macedonia, coffee from Yemen, and ice packed down from Anatolian mountains. In the common quarters, simpler fare nourished no less richly. Lentil soup at dawn, olives and flatbread shared beneath fig trees, tea poured from high above to cool and impress, and always the coffee, thick, bitter, sacred. Introduced from Arabia and embraced like scripture, it became the heartbeat of a new ritual, the coffee house. There, men gathered not just to drink, but to debate, to recite poems, to share news, to dream. The empire flowed through these spaces. Sometimes sultans feared them, banned them, fearing rebellion brewed in every bitter cup. But like fire, like ideas, coffee could not be forbidden for long. In these houses, poets earned their names. Verses danced across lips like smoke. A man might be poor in coin, but rich in couplets. Even sultans wrote. Suleiman himself, under the name Muhibi, composed lines of longing that were whispered in alleys long after his armies had disbanded. Women, too, lived with depth and nuance in this world. The outer image, a harem filled with idle beauty, was a Western fantasy. The reality was quieter and sharper. Within the harem, education, politics, and lineage flowed like silk. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, often wielded immense power, advising, protecting, maneuvering with a grace few men could match. Women like Hurrem's Sultan rose from slavery to shape the empire's future. She built mosques, endowments, hospitals. She wrote letters to kings. Her influence echoed through generations. In the streets, women ran shops, owned property, and filed lawsuits in courts. Their voices, though modest in volume, carried legal weight. In the market, in the hammam, in the home, they were not shadows, they were roots. Entertainment, though modest, was never absent. In the evenings of Ramadan, laughter bubbled from shadow plays, karagars and hasivat mocking politics, religion, and everyday life with wit sharp enough to draw blood, but soft enough to draw a crowd. Musicians played the oud and knee, their sounds both festive and meditative. Weddings filled streets with tambourines and ululations. Children chased one another through dust and light, tasting sweets, learning songs, beginning their own chapters in a never-ending story. And above it all, the empire's rhythm, not always just, not always peaceful, but unmistakably alive. Here was a place where a Bosnian mason might build a mosque in Damascus, where a Jewish doctor might treat a Muslim vizier, where an Armenian poet might win the patronage of a Kurdish governor. A Sufi from Konya might offer tea to a Greek trader in Thessaloniki, and neither would see the other as foreign. Faith was a compass, law was a scaffold. But it was this daily harmony, this quiet miracle of coexistence, that made the empire more than an accident of conquest. It made it a civilization. Not perfect, but real, not eternal, but unforgettable. And, as the wind moved through the courtyards of cities, built by many hands, the empire whispered to itself in many tongues, all woven into one breath. This was not simply the rule of Ottomans. It was a moment in history when humanity, fragmented, flawed, faithful, dared to live together under one sky, facing the same sun. And though that sun would one day set, for centuries it rose over a world that had learned to be many things, and still, somehow, one. The empire did not grow on poetry alone. Behind the calm of marble mosques and the laughter of shadow puppets, there beat the pulse of a world trained for war. From the earliest days of Osmans, frontier raids to the gates of Vienna. The Ottoman Empire was built with sword and strategy, a machine of conquest fed by doctrine, hierarchy, and holy fire. War, for the Ottomans, was not chaos. It was order in motion, a science, a divine responsibility. The Sultan was not merely a king. He was the shadow of God on earth, the sword of justice, the shepherd of the faithful. And when he declared war, it was not only for territory. It was for the preservation of balance, the punishment of arrogance, the spreading of justice where tyranny had grown fat. When the call went out, it was not shouted. It moved like a tide. Riders galloped across provinces. Mosque pulpits stirred with sermons of duty. Farmers became scouts. Blacksmiths hammered blades late into the night. Horses were fed dates and brushed with care. Across mountains and rivers, the empire began to move. At the heart of this was the army, not a mob of warriors, but an institution that rivaled the state itself. Its backbone was the professional soldier, and none stood taller than the Janissary. The Janissary Corps was no ordinary force, born from the Devshirme system. They were once Christian boys, taken from their villages in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood not only in war, but in obedience, literacy, and theology. They were cut from their pasts, reshaped by ritual, and rebuilt into instruments of the empire. They belonged to no tribe, no family, no ambition, only to the Sultan. Their training was relentless, their uniforms stark, their silence legendary. They marched without song, fought without fear, and died without hesitation. Their loyalty was absolute, their discipline admired even by their enemies. While European armies groaned with unpaid mercenaries and fractured, feudal loyalties, the Janissaries stood like a single will. But they were not machines. They were scholars of battle, men who read Qurans in barracks and debated jurisprudence when off duty. They viewed their service not as a profession, but as a religious calling. To die in battle was to be a martyr. To protect the empire was to serve the divine order. Yet the army was not only Janissaries. The Ottoman military stretched like a web. There were the Sipahis, cavalrymen granted timars, or land, in exchange for military service. They were the knightly class, guardians of the provinces, defenders of roads and trade routes. Their armour gleamed under Anatolian suns. Their horses were trained for the charge and the turn. In times of peace, they farmed. In times of war, they answered the call. There were artillery units, masters of the cannon, engineers of destruction who dragged bronze monsters across impossible terrain. There were miners who dug beneath enemy walls, sappers who collapsed fortresses with silence. There were archers, fast and lethal, trained since childhood to strike in rhythm with breath. There were naval fleets rising in later centuries, where galleys powered by chained rowers clashed with Christian armadas across the Mediterranean. All of it moved not by chaos but by design. Campaigns were planned with mathematical precision. Roads were mapped, rivers studied, grain counted, letters sent to governors weeks in advance. When the Ottomans went to war, they carried with them not only weapons, but a vision of how the world should be rearranged. And so the empire grew. Into Europe, they flowed like water seeking the cracks in stone. Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, Wallachia, all fell one by one, not only by sword, but by diplomacy, by marriage, by subtle pressure. Some rulers submitted and kept their crowns. Others resisted and lost their heads. Towns that accepted became provinces. Towns that rebelled became ashes. They swept across the Balkans, reached the Danube, crossed into Hungary. Cities surrendered and were allowed to keep their churches, their customs, their coins. Only taxes changed. In return, roads were repaired, markets protected, and bandits hunted to extinction. For many, Ottoman rule meant not slavery but structure. In the East, they clashed with other Muslim powers, empires that rivaled their own in might and legitimacy. The Mamluks of Egypt held the keys to Mecca and Medina. The Safavids of Persia, armed with Shia theology and Persian fire, challenged Ottoman Sunni authority. These were not simple border disputes. They were theological duels, wars of identity and inheritance. Under Selimai, the Ottomans turned south with fury. At the Battle of Marj Dabik in 1516, they crushed the Mamluks and seized control of Syria. A year later, Egypt fell. Cairo bowed. The Abbasid Caliph, long a symbolic relic, handed the Prophet's relics to Selim, who now stood as both Sultan and Caliph, political and spiritual head of the Sunni Muslim world. This was more than conquest. It was coronation. With the Hijaz under Ottoman control, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina came under imperial protection. The Sultan became the servant of the Haramain. Caravans of pilgrims moved under Janissary guard. Roads to Hajj were maintained, water stations built. Every Ramadan, imperial gifts were sent to the Kaaba. To rule these lands was not only power, it was burden. It was a sacred trust. The Ottomans understood this. They did not claim divine right without duty, and so they built, administered, protected, prayed. In the north, they reached the gates of Vienna. In the west, they dominated the seas. In the east, they kept Persia at bay. And at the heart of it all, Istanbul watched with calm eyes, her domes rising like mountains of prayer above the Bosphorus. The empire, though vast, was not stretched thin, because its strength lay not only in land, but in law. For every conquest there was a judge, for every fortress, a mosque, for every general, a scribe. War was not a rupture, it was a rebalancing. When cities were taken, scholars were invited, libraries spared, merchants offered incentives, churches, if not needed, were left intact. Artisans were resettled, not enslaved. The aim was not eradication, but absorption. The Ottoman sword was sharp, but its sheath was velvet. Yet even velvet frays, and even swords dull. The very systems that once gave the army its edge would, in time, become the seeds of its undoing. But that would come later. For now, in this moment of steel and strategy, the empire stood vast and defiant. Its armies were not just feared, they were respected. Its leaders were not merely kings. They were commanders of the faithful, stewards of a cosmic order. And in every province where the call to prayer rose above rooftops, in every outpost where the crescent fluttered beside the sound of hooves, the people knew that the empire was more than a government. It was a rhythm, a promise, a force that came not only to conquer, but to define. The rhythm of empire did not pause. After the conquests of Selimai, it was his son, Suleiman, who turned the sword into a symphony. He was not called magnificent without reason. To the Ottomans, he was Kanuni, the lawgiver. To the Europeans, he was the Grand Turk. And to history, he became the towering figure of an empire at its golden zenith. He inherited a world already wide, yet he widened it still. In 1521, the Danube shimmered beneath his ships as he captured Belgrade, the key to Central Europe, long denied to his forebears. In 1522, his fleets turned south to the rocky stronghold of Rhodes, seat of the Knights Hospitaller. The siege dragged through months of resistance, cannon fire echoing across white stone and sea spray. But the Ottomans prevailed. The knights departed, their banners torn, their legacy fading like smoke over the Aegean. Then came Hungary. In 1526, on the fields of Moho-CS, two worlds collided. The Hungarian army, armoured and noble, trusted in valour and tradition. The Ottomans, disciplined and vast, marched with cannons, cavalry, and silence. The battle lasted little more than an hour. When it ended, the Hungarian king was dead, his army drowned in swamp and ash. Hungary, once a proud kingdom, fractured. The road to Vienna lay open. 2 years later, in 1529, Suleiman marched on the Habsburg capital. Rain poured. Roads turned to rivers of mud. The Ottoman army, vast and prepared, surrounded Vienna and battered its walls. But the siege faltered. Supplies ran thin. The city, though shaken, held. The Ottomans withdrew, not in defeat, but in restraint. Vienna would remain their edge, their unfinished sentence, their mirage on the horizon. Still, the empire held the lion's share of southeast Europe. Transylvania, Wallachia, Moldavia, vassals now. The Black Sea, once a Christian lake, became an Ottoman pond, and on the seas, a new front opened. While Suleiman shaped the land, his admiral, Hayreddin Barbarossa, ruled the waves. A former corsair turned Grand Admiral, he swept across the Mediterranean like a storm clad in sails. Tunis, Algiers, Tripoli, once bastions of European power, fell under the crescent. His fleets battled the combined navies of Spain, Venice, and the papacy. Even when outnumbered, the Ottomans manoeuvred like shadows on water. At Preveza in 1538, they shattered the Holy League, securing Ottoman dominance of the eastern Mediterranean for decades. In India, Ottoman envoys traded letters with the Mughals. In Asia, on the edge of the Indian Ocean, local sultans flew the Ottoman flag, if only in hope. Across the Red Sea, Ottoman garrisons defended the coasts of Yemen and Arabia. In Baghdad, Persian blood was spilled and banners replaced. And in the heart of Arabia, the pilgrimage routes were kept sacred, safe under Janissary watch. But the Ottoman Empire was never only expansion. It was administration. War may have opened the gates, but governance kept them standing. Suleiman, between campaigns, sat with scribes and scholars, refining the Qanun, the secular law code that complemented Sharia. His justice reached the smallest villages, where a peasant might file a complaint against a tax collector and be heard. His bureaucracy was a lattice of paper, ink, and order, reaching from mountaintop fortresses to the decks of merchant ships. The army moved with the same logic. Campaigns were seasonal, planned with clockwork care. Logistics mattered more than valor. Supply caravans stretched for miles. Bridges were built, roads paved. Soldiers were expected to be both warriors and servants of civilization. Yet beneath the triumphs, cracks began to form. The very institutions that had fueled Ottoman success were growing bloated. The Janissaries, once austere and loyal, began to taste power beyond obedience. Their influence at court grew. Their discipline frayed. They began to marry, own property, lobby for succession. Slowly, they transformed from elite guardians into political players. They remained feared, but no longer incorruptible. The Devshirme system that once filled their ranks declined. It had long brought tension, taking Christian sons, however noble the path offered. Now, with its fading, the Janissary corps grew less distinct. Muslim-born volunteers entered the ranks. Standards shifted. Warfare itself changed. The European world, though bruised, was learning. Cannons became larger, more mobile. Fortresses grew thicker. The printing press spread ideas. Naval technology advanced. While the Ottomans held fast to their proven systems, their enemies adapted. Yet still, the empire endured. Suleiman died in 1566 during the siege of Szigetvar in Hungary. His death was hidden from the army until the campaign concluded. Such was the fear of disorder. His heart was buried there, beneath the soil of Europe, while his body was returned to Istanbul and laid beneath the mosque that bore his name. Built by Sinan, his architect and companion. His reign marked not only the peak of Ottoman power, but the final moment before the tide began to slow. The sultans who followed inherited vast lands and deep systems, but the clarity of purpose began to waver. Wars continued, but more often they were stalemates. Victories cost more. Defeats cut deeper. The Janissaries demanded higher wages, revolted when denied. Corruption crept into the provinces. Local governors built miniature kingdoms. Still, for generations, the army remained a force to be reckoned with. In 1683, once again they marched on Vienna. The siege was grand, complex, and bold. But this time, the world had changed. A coalition of European powers united. On the plains outside the city, Polish cavalry charged with fury. The Ottoman lines broke. The defeat marked a turning point. No longer would the empire threaten the heart of Europe. The sword had not broken, but it had lost its edge. And yet, even as military might waned, the myth endured. Across deserts and rivers, in the songs of soldiers and the prayers of villagers, the Ottomans were still the warriors of the Prophet, defenders of the Haramain, bulwark against chaos. They had built an army not just of men, but of memory. A legacy of discipline, hierarchy, and divine sanction. The sound of marching boots, the flutter of the crescent banner, the silence of the Janissary columns before battle, all of it had become sacred rhythm. The empire was aging, but it still moved with the dignity of one who had danced with history, led it by the hand, and written its name in both blood and gold. The sword still hung above the map, and while it no longer cut as cleanly, the world had not forgotten the hand that once wielded it. There comes a moment in every empire's life when it no longer needs to conquer to feel powerful, when its silence carries more weight than 1,000 drums, when the stones laid in its cities speak more loudly than the cries on a battlefield. For the Ottomans, that moment came under the reign of Suleiman. He was a warrior, yes, but also a judge, a builder, a poet, and a dreamer. And though his armies marched farther than any sultan before him, his true greatness lay not in the ground he gained, but in the world he shaped. The Golden Age did not begin with a coronation. It began in corridors of law, in the rhythm of artisans' hands, in the fragrance of ink drying on imperial decrees. It began when conquest was no longer a necessity, but a question of refinement. How do you govern what you already own? How do you turn fear into faith and authority into harmony? Suleiman's answer was justice. Not the justice of slogans or punishments, but of balance. The kind that seeped into every layer of life, from palace gardens to mountain villages. He gathered scholars and jurists, not to flatter him, but to challenge him. He sat among them, not as a god, but as a man accountable before God. The Sharia remained sacred, but Suleiman also compiled a civil code, known as Qanun, a body of secular laws that filled the gaps between divine rulings and daily life. Land ownership, taxation, inheritance, trade, all systematized, refined, clarified. For the first time in generations, a farmer in Bosnia and a merchant in Cairo could appeal to the same legal logic. A Christian craftsman in Aleppo and a Jewish bookseller in Salonika could trust the courts to defend their rights. Justice did not always win, but it had a language, and that language wore Suleiman's name. But he did not stop with law. He looked to the skyline. The mosques of Istanbul, already impressive, were about to be transformed. Into this vision stepped a man of stone and soul. Mimar Sinan, the greatest architect the empire would ever know. Born to a Christian family in Anatolia, trained in the Janissary Corps, Sinan had seen fortresses and cathedrals across Europe and Asia. He understood geometry not only as a science, but as a prayer. With Suleiman's blessing, Sinan raised a new Istanbul. He built the Sulaymani Mosque, not to mimic Hagia Sophia, but to surpass it, not in arrogance, but in elegance. Its dome rose like a planet drawn by divine gravity, supported by columns that whispered eternity. Its courtyards, libraries, soup kitchens, and schools formed a complex not only of faith, but of function. He built mosques in Edirne, aqueducts in Syria, bridges in the Balkans. He designed tombs where silence echoed like a song. His architecture did not declare power, it invited awe. And around these monuments, the empire pulsed with life. In bazaars, goldsmiths carved delicate patterns into wedding bands. In libraries, scholars debated astronomy beneath hanging lamps. In kitchens, chefs tested combinations of mint, lamb, rice, and rosewater. In coffee houses, poets recited verses that tugged at the soul. In caravanserais, travelers from Persia and Venice shared meals, trading spices for silk, stories for silence. It was an empire of elegance, of dignity woven into daily life. The capital reflected it most. Istanbul, once Byzantine Constantinople, now stood as a mirror of the empire's soul. The call to prayer rose 5 times a day, from minarets scattered like stars. Ships from 3 continents docked at its harbours. Greek and Armenian priests walked beside Muslim judges. African servants worked in the same kitchens as Circassian chefs. Slavic guards saluted Arab diplomats. Each district had its own rhythm, but the city breathed as one. The Topkapı Palace, once a fortress of power, now became a palace of refinement. Gardens bloomed in geometric perfection. Fountains whispered in marble courtyards. The Sultan's council met beneath domes painted with restraint. Music played in chambers where tiles told stories in blue, and within that palace, Suleiman ruled. Not from distance, but through dialogue. His reign was not absent of violence or rebellion, but his hand was steady, his words measured. Even his enemies, when writing of him, struggled to summon insult. He wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibi, the lover. His verses were not proclamations of strength, but confessions of heart. He wrote of absence, of longing, of divinity. His lines were recited not in courts of law, but in the corners of tea-houses, where lovers waited for answers. And beside him, shaping his court and family, was Hurrem Sultan, his consort, his companion, and one of the most influential women in Ottoman history. She rose from slavery to sovereignty, not through seduction, but through intellect and loyalty. She bore him children, advised his court, and founded charitable complexes that served the poor and educated orphans. She was not merely a figure of beauty. She was a pillar of the Golden Age. Together, they redefined what it meant to rule, not with grandeur alone, but with meaning. across the empire. Provinces mirrored the capital's tone. Governors were appointed not only for loyalty, but for competence. Cities like Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, and Thessaloniki thrived under careful watch. Taxes were collected with precision, but not brutality. Schools were funded, roads paved, waters managed. When famine struck Anatolia, grain was shipped from Egypt. When floods hit the Balkans, funds were diverted from palace projects. The empire remembered its people, and the people responded with devotion. The Sultan's name was written into the Friday sermon. His image, carved in ink, hung in caravans, shops, and homes. When pilgrims left for Mecca, they carried banners with his crest. When letters were written to the empires of the world, Ming China, Mughal India, France, and Spain, they were signed not with arrogance, but with the confidence of one who had nothing to prove. Suleiman did not merely expand borders. He expanded what the Ottoman world believed was possible. And yet, the Golden Age was not free of shadows. Ambitions stirred. Successions were bitter. Rebellions sparked in distant lands. Conspiracies curled like smoke in palace chambers. But these were not yet symptoms of decay. They were signs of life. Even in glory, the empire remained human, and as domes rose, laws solidified, and art blossomed, the world beyond took notice. Europe watched in awe and fear. Kings studied Ottoman methods. Architects copied Ottoman lines. Poets borrowed Ottoman meters. Diplomats came with gifts and stayed with envy. For in this moment, the Ottomans were not merely conquerors. They were custodians of a civilization in bloom. The sword was still sharp, but now it rested beside the pen. The empire had learned something rare, that true greatness does not lie in how far you can march, but in how long your shadow brings comfort. And beneath that shadow, millions lived, prayed, dreamed. This was the empire's highest hour. Not in gold, but in balance. And in that balance, the Ottomans became more than rulers. They became a story the world would not forget. The sun over the Ottoman world did not rise only on battlefields and courts. It warmed the domes of mosques, the walls of madrasas, the windows of observatories, the pages of books yet unfinished. If law gave the empire its spine and conquest its muscle, it was knowledge that gave it breath. And in the age of Suleiman, that breath flowed through every corner of life. In the cities of the empire, Cairo, Edirne, Damascus, Baghdad, Mecca, students rose before dawn to memorize verses and calculate distances between stars. In schools funded by Waqf endowments, boys, and in some places girls, learned the rhythms of the Quran, the logic of scholars, the precision of arithmetic. They debated philosophy, studied medicine, and copied manuscripts by candlelight. In Istanbul alone, the pulse of learning beat in 100 courtyards. The madrasa was more than a school. It was a meeting place of heaven and earth. Its walls echoed with the words of Al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, Razi, and Nasir al-Din Tusi. Scholars argued gently beneath the shade of fig trees. Some pursued law, others mathematics. Others turned toward mysticism, seeking truths deeper than language. The ulama, the scholars, walked the empire like a conscience. They sat on benches in courtrooms and across from sultans. They taught humility to judges, justice to rulers. They were not merely thinkers. They were guardians of meaning. Their fatwas were recited in marketplaces. Their reputations outlived their tombs. But not all knowledge was solemn. In Damascus, apothecaries mixed ointments of lavender and clove. In Cairo, Physicians performed cataract surgeries with precision inherited from generations of manuals. In Bursa, astronomers charted lunar eclipses with tools designed in the days of the Abbasids. They improved them, carved them anew in brass and ivory, passing them to students who would one day surpass them. The Ottomans did not invent these sciences, but they preserved them, refined them, and gave them the protection of empire. In the libraries of Topkapı Palace, scribes copied ancient Greek texts, translated into Arabic centuries before. They added margins filled with commentary, notes, challenges, and praise. They treated paper as sacred, binding it with covers stitched in silk and pressed with gold. In this world, a book was not only a possession, it was a vessel of divine trust. And poetry wove through every discipline, like thread through cloth. It was recited in court, but also in kitchens, read in battle camps, whispered in gardens. Sultan Suleiman himself, under his pen name Muhibi, wrote hundreds of ghazals. His verses spoke not of empire, but of love, longing, mortality. They were not declarations, they were confessions. Others wrote too. Poets like Baki filled the palaces with metaphors that outlived the marble they were spoken beneath. Their words floated across the empire like migrating birds, landing on the lips of peasants and scholars alike. Even the call to prayer, recited 5 times a day, was not just a ritual. It was a performance. Muezzins trained their voices as carefully as a janissary trained his sword hand. The adhan was a song that belonged to everyone, rising above cities as the sun did, familiar and reassuring, echoing through alleys and over rivers. Artisans, too, expressed this rhythm. The tile-makers of Iznik crafted mosaics in floral patterns, so intricate they seemed to bloom anew each time one blinked. Their colours, deep cobalt blue, emerald green, iron red, adorned palaces, mosques, tombs. No human figures, only geometry and nature. Only the divine reflected in the curve of a leaf. Weavers in Anatolia knotted carpets by hand, each thread a meditation. Patterns from Caucasus to Kurdistan bore symbols of harvest, protection, lineage, and prayer. A carpet was not only for feet, it was for memory. And in the kitchens, the empire's refinement took a different form. Food was an expression of geography, migration, and hospitality. A dish might carry the heritage of 10 cities: saffron from Persia, cinnamon from Ceylon, olive oil from Crete, lamb from the steppes, rice from Egypt, honey from Anatolia. Feasts were not only for sultans. They were for the poor, the traveller, the orphan. Mosques built during this age often included minarets, soup kitchens open to all. The idea was simple. No one should sleep hungry in the shadow of a dome. Even the smallest gesture was elevated by purpose. A rose was not only a flower, it was a symbol of the prophet. Eye gardens were not merely beautiful, they reflected paradise. Water was not simply useful, it was purification, mercy, life. The very act of sweeping a mosque was considered worship. This sense of holiness embedded in the ordinary gave the Ottoman Golden Age its glow. People lived not to accumulate wealth or fame, but to contribute to a structure larger than themselves. A weaver saw himself in the empire's cloth. A sailor felt pride not just in distance travelled, but in routes secured for pilgrims. A mother teaching her child the basmala believed she was upholding the empire itself. But beneath the gold, cracks whispered. Even as scholars debated in madrasas, some noted that the empire's scientific frontier was beginning to slow. While Europe stirred with mechanical experiments, new telescopes, and printing presses, the Ottomans hesitated. The printing press, introduced in the Islamic world in the 15th century, was long resisted in Ottoman domains for fear of misuse. For fear it would spread error faster than truth. By the time presses were allowed in Arabic and Ottoman Turkish, Europe was already printing millions of books. The empire's scholars still copied by hand. Beautiful, yes, but slow. In the race of innovation, the Ottomans had chosen preservation. Their view was not foolish. They feared chaos, distortion, and secularism. They valued balance over progress for progress's sake. But history, like water, favors the moving current. The palace grew more inward. Successors to Suleiman inherited a throne encircled by ceremony. Some were wise, others less so. Power often passed not to the strongest, but to the eldest surviving son. And sometimes, to keep peace, brothers were strangled upon a sultan's death. A brutal practice meant to prevent civil war, yet one that drained the court of competition. Later, to avoid bloodshed, heirs were kept in isolation, the cafes, or the cage, where they lived in guarded apartments, removed from the world. Some emerged as sultans unprepared, fearful, or unstable. The balance that had once held conquest and culture together began to tilt. And yet the world still looked to Istanbul. Travelers from France, Poland, and India wrote of its splendor. Scholars from Africa sought its mosques. Refugees from Spain, Persia, and Italy found shelter in its streets. The Ottoman Empire remained, in the eyes of millions, the center of the world. For it had built something rare, a civilization where domes echoed with meaning, where law reflected compassion, where power knelt beside piety, and where the empire was not a burden, but a belonging. The sun had not yet begun to set, but its light, while golden, had started to fade at the edges, and those who watched closely could see it. Not clearly, not yet, but they could feel it. The songs still played, the domes still shone, the courts still echoed with judgment, but the world outside was moving faster, and soon the empire would have to choose whether to follow, to resist, or to become a memory. Power, once seized, is rarely left unchallenged. The Ottomans had built an empire upon war and law, faith and order. But behind the silk curtains of their courts, another game unfolded. One that did not echo with the thunder of cannons or the call to prayer. It was a game of silence, secrets, and shifting eyes. For centuries, the image of the Sultan projected order. He sat enthroned beneath stained glass and Quranic verse, a monarch draped in justice, mercy, and might. But few understood what churned beneath the surface of the palace. The Sultan's court was a mosaic of factions, alliances, bloodlines, and whispers. And sometimes, a whisper could be sharper than any blade. The deeper into the empire one looked, the more delicate the balance became. Behind every decree, there were hands guiding the ink. Behind every campaign, a debate at court. Behind every rise, a plotted fall. In the hallowed corridors of Topkapı Palace, power was never held alone. The Sultan was supreme, yes, but around him circled viziers, eunuchs, concubines, scholars, and spies. Each with loyalty claimed, each with ambition cloaked. In this world, survival was an art. Among the most powerful voices behind the throne were the grand viziers, the prime ministers of the empire. Chosen for brilliance, charisma, and obedience, they bore the empire's weight when the Sultan chose to retreat from daily rule. But with power came peril. A grand vizier could be adored one year and strangled the next. Many entered Topkap through grand processions, only to leave wrapped in silence, and within the walls of the harem another empire stirred. Contrary to fantasy, the imperial harem was not merely a gilded prison of beauty, it was a political engine. The women who lived there were not idle. They were taught poetry, diplomacy, languages, and law. Some came as captives from distant lands, Circassia, Hungary, Georgia, the Levant. Others were born into Ottoman homes and rose through service and charm. Their lives were defined by ritual, loyalty, and maneuvering. At the center stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. Once her son took the throne, her influence expanded. She advised on appointments, alliances, and marriages. She mediated palace rivalries. In an empire without queens, she was the queen behind the curtain. Some women reached further still. Hurrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana, was once a Ukrainian slave. She captured the heart of Suleiman the Magnificent, and more importantly, his trust. She broke tradition by marrying him, bore him sons, and shaped the line of succession. She corresponded with kings. She endowed mosques. She outlived her rivals and saw her children seated on thrones. Her legacy was not unique. Many women followed her path, carving corridors of influence through a palace that pretended to be still. These women could make or break viziers, tilt the succession, or save provinces from collapse. Some did so for the good of the empire, others for vengeance, family, or survival. In the age historians would later call the Sultanate of women, female voices shaped the fate of millions. And though the records of men carried most of history's ink, the hand behind the curtain held the pen. But not all intrigue was born within the palace. Some came from across oceans and deserts, from the shifting lands of Europe, the old kingdoms of the Jews, the fractured loyalties of Arab tribes, the plotting embassies of foreign powers. In Al-Quds, in Jerusalem, where prophets had walked and faiths had collided, tension always simmered. The city, sacred to three religions, lay under Ottoman rule for centuries. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side under the millet system, each community governed by its own leaders, laws, and traditions. But beneath the surface, ambition stirred. In Ottoman times, there were rumors, true or twisted, of factions seeking to shift control of the holy city. Wealthy Jewish families from across the Mediterranean began settling there, acquiring land, building homes, investing in schools and synagogues. This was not forbidden. The Ottomans allowed it, taxed it, even benefited from it. But some began to whisper of plans beyond piety, of influence stretching too far. Couriers brought letters to Istanbul warning of plots to buy up entire quarters of the old city. Some claimed these efforts were backed by powerful Jewish financiers in Europe, protected by foreign consuls, immune to local law. A few Ottoman administrators demanded tighter restrictions, citing fears of imbalance. Others dismissed it, seeing it as envy cloaked in faith. Still, the tension grew. At court, rivalries formed. Some viziers favored tolerance and inclusion. Others saw foreign interest in the Holy Land as a prelude to imperial games. The British, the French, the Russians, all hovered nearby, each protecting their sects, their pilgrims, their holy sites. Churches were refurbished, monasteries claimed, graves contested. A stone moved in the wrong quarter could ignite riots. In this atmosphere, rumors bred like smoke. Some said European Jews wanted to restore a kingdom in Palestine. Others insisted it was slander spread by jealous Christians. Meanwhile, Jewish communities within the empire remained mostly loyal, respectful of law, grateful for Ottoman protection from persecution elsewhere. And yet, the whispers did not cease. Some of these suspicions found form in blood libels, in baseless accusations of treason, in the language of fear. Most were unfounded. But in an empire strained by foreign pressure, local unrest, and the slow tightening of European hands around Ottoman lands, even falsehoods found listeners. It was not always plots and poison. Sometimes, conspiracies were born of fear, not intent. But fear, once stirred, does not retreat easily. Inside the palace, foreign ambassadors brought their own schemes. The French wanted privileges. The Venetians wanted trade. The Austrians offered treaties with hidden knives. Gifts were given, spies recruited, marriages proposed. The empire had once been the hunter. Now it found itself hunted with smiles. Even within the military, conspiracies grew. The Janissaries, once a corps of sacred discipline, now wielded their power like a dagger at the Sultan's side. They revolted when pay was delayed. They demanded influence over succession. They executed sultans they disliked, crowned those they preferred. What had begun as protection had become a threat. Sultans, once feared, now feared. They wore armor beneath robes. They ordered food tasted. They prayed in private. Each morning might bring flowers or poison. And yet, even in this era of uncertainty, the empire endured. For every plot, there was loyalty. For every whisper, a prayer. For every betrayal, a reckoning. The Ottomans had ruled for centuries not by accident, but by adaptability. They learned to dance with the shadows, to fight not only with armies, but with patience, perception, and God's name on their tongue. In a world where nothing was fixed, they built an empire that floated upon tension, carried not by force alone, but by balance, carefully measured, carefully guarded, and always just one breath away from change. The sword no longer gleamed as brightly, but it was still drawn. And as long as it remained in the Sultan's reach, no whisper, however sharp, could yet claim the throne. The empire had once been the eye of the storm, the unmoving center around which the ambitions of kings and emperors swirled like dust. But by the 18th century, the storm crept inward. No longer did the Ottomans dictate the terms of the world. Now the world came to them, smiling, trading, bribing, praying, plotting. It began with letters, sealed in wax, laced in French or Italian or Latin. They crossed borders more easily than armies. They arrived from Vienna, Paris, St. Petersburg, and London. Some bore trade agreements, others demands, others still invisible ink. At first, they were received with diplomacy, then with suspicion, then with dread. The European powers had learned that they could not defeat the Ottoman Empire by sword alone, but with patience, influence, and paper. They could unwind it thread by thread. They began to interfere not just with ambassadors and coin, but with people, subjects of the Sultan, drawn from the heart of his own cities, offered protection, promise, and foreign purpose. Christians under Ottoman rule were suddenly offered protection by France, Russia, and Austria. Jews in Ottoman lands were backed by financiers in London and Amsterdam. Orthodox communities received envoys from Moscow and Athens. Foreign schools opened. Foreign newspapers appeared. Foreign money flowed into native hands, and with it, foreign causes. Some of it came from genuine solidarity. Much of it came from strategy. The empire was vast, but its heart was scattered. Every minority was seen as a lever, every sacred site a token. Al-Quds, Bethlehem, Mount Athos, places of prayer turned into chess squares. A monk arrested in Jerusalem became a cause for European intervention. A land dispute between two churches drew in armies. A Jewish merchant's complaint could spark a diplomatic storm. And still, the Ottomans tried to hold the threads. They offered reforms. They issued edicts promising equality, protection, harmony. They hosted peace conferences, rewrote laws, created offices for diplomacy they once disdained. But each compromise became a precedent. Each precedent, a weakness. In Al-Quds, the pressure thickened. The city, sacred to all, became a cage of politics. The Jewish community, long protected under the millet system, now found itself pulled between gratitude to the empire and opportunity from Europe. Wealthy families arrived from abroad, buying property, building schools, planting roots. Some did so with love and hope. Others with the silent backing of those who dreamt not of living alongside others, but of replacing them. Ottoman authorities noticed. Reports flooded in. Local officials complained of sudden land transactions. Papers written in foreign hands, legal tricks bypassing tax and oversight. The Sultan's court debated. Some wanted restrictions. Others saw profit. The debate echoed through mosques, synagogues, and cafes. Among the Christian communities, divisions deepened. Catholics supported by France, Orthodox by Russia, Protestants by Britain. Churches fought over who could clean what stair in what quarter of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. What should have been a place of shared sanctity became a constant battlefield of keys, candles, and custodians. And all the while, the foreign embassies smiled. They offered scholarships, safe passage, guns. They printed books, offered protection from local law, and sowed doubt. Subjects of the Sultan began to ask, in whispers, if perhaps their future lay not in Istanbul, but in Europe, in Paris, in Vienna, in Moscow. The Ottomans tried to restore balance. They sent reformers, some wise, some cruel. They passed the Tanzimat reforms, promising citizenship to all, regardless of religion. They opened secular schools. They abolished the devshirme. They modernized the army. They printed new law codes, built new ministries, borrowed money to build railroads and telegraphs. But the money came with chains. European banks demanded privileges. Debts grew. The empire, once lender of gold, became debtor of silver. Foreign advisors were placed inside Ottoman ministries. A shadow government formed, speaking in French, financed in London, hiding behind smiles. And in the capital, conspiracies became daily bread. The Janissaries, already corrupted, were abolished after years of rebellion, but other factions grew. Secret societies among intellectuals, reformists, and revolutionaries sprouted like weeds. Some dreamed of restoring the caliphate's strength. Others wanted a secular empire. Others still wanted independence. Arab, Armenian, Greek, Kurdish, Albanian. All whispered in corners, published anonymous pamphlets, drew maps no one else had seen. Even inside the Sultan's own family, trust eroded. Brothers were locked away in gilded cages to prevent coups. Courtiers spied on each other. Food tasters were employed by the dozen. The palace grew more paranoid, more ceremonial, less aware of the world unraveling outside its gates. There were coup attempts, some quiet, some bloody. Sultans were deposed not with swords, but with legal documents, petitions, pressure from foreign capitals. The empire, once feared for its unpredictability, became predictable. And that was the greatest danger of all. Among the Jewish communities, fears and hopes ran together. Many remained loyal to the empire, remembering the refuge it had given them. When the Catholic monarchs of Spain and Portugal expelled their ancestors, Ottoman Jews were poets, physicians, and merchants. Some rose to court. Others advised governors. But as Zionist ideas arrived from Europe, carried by newly arrived settlers or foreign trained youth, the balance began to tip. Some Jewish leaders urged caution. Others saw opportunity. They built farms, founded organizations, spoke of national revival. And in Istanbul, the state took notice. Laws were passed. Surveillance increased. But enforcement was inconsistent. Corruption made regulation porous. And the empire, tired and distracted, was unsure whether it was facing a revolution or a dream. In the streets, ordinary people struggled. Inflation rose. Bread lines formed. Foreign goods flooded markets. Artisans went bankrupt. Peasants sold their land. Young men, disillusioned, joined underground groups. Some dreamed of nationalism. Others of socialism. Others of vengeance. The Ottomans had ruled for centuries on a principle of controlled plurality. Many faiths, many tongues, one law. But now the law was ignored. The tongues competed. The faiths were politicized. And yet, for many, the empire still mattered. Old men still kissed the hand of the Sultan's portrait. Villagers prayed for the Caliph. Pilgrims wept at Mecca under the green banner. Mothers named their sons after sultans. The empire was sick, but not yet dead. Its breath shallow. Its limbs aching. But the heart still beat. In mosques and courtyards, men recited the names of Suleiman, Selim, Mehmed. They remembered the walls of Vienna, the domes of Jerusalem, the scrolls of Cairo. They told their children that this was not how it would end. But the shadows said otherwise. The conspiracies had spread, not because they were brilliant, but because they had time. The Ottomans had ruled too long without watching their foundations, and now termites danced behind the walls. And in a world where whispers travelled faster than armies, it was no longer cannons the empire feared, but pens, coins, flags, and the questions no empire ever wants to hear. Who are we now? And how long until we are no longer? The empire did not fall with a cry. It fell with a sigh. Long before the world called it the sick man of Europe, the Ottomans themselves knew something was wrong. The palaces were still lit. The call to prayer still echoed from minarets. The imperial tugra still shimmered on documents. But something vital had gone missing. Not the crown. Not the army. Something deeper. The sense that time was on their side. It had been centuries since Osman dreamed of a tree whose branches touched the skies. Now the roots of that tree trembled. The soil was loose, the winds unfamiliar. For too long, the empire had carried its greatness like a memory worn smooth by repetition. But memories don't hold walls together, and echoes don't stop revolutions. The cracks had begun generations before. The Janissaries, once the sharpest blade in the Sultan's hand, had long since rusted into a political mob. Once bound by vows of celibacy and obedience, they now married, owned shops, bribed officials, and revolted at the smell of reform. When the empire tried to modernize its army, to learn from Europe, to adopt new drills and rifles and ranks, the Janissaries rioted. They saw change as betrayal, and for decades they succeeded in halting it. But one cannot halt time. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud Su'a decided to end the rot. He formed a new military corps in secret, trained in European fashion, loyal only to him. When the Janissaries revolted, as expected, he unleashed the full might of the palace upon them. Cannons roared in the streets of Istanbul. The barracks burned. Thousands died. The once sacred corpse, feared and proud, was erased in a single week. The empire had killed its oldest protector to save itself. But there was no peace in victory. The provinces no longer trembled at the Sultan's shadow. In the Balkans, the fires of nationalism had begun to spread. Greece, long a jewel in the Ottoman crown, broke away in blood. Poets in London wrote verses of Hellenic freedom. European volunteers joined Greek rebels. Russian ships loomed off the coast. The Ottomans, tired and divided, could not hold the tide. By 1830, Greece was independent. Elsewhere, the same winds blew. Serbia rose. Romania demanded autonomy. Bulgaria murmured. Armenians organized. Arabs whispered. Every province, once a thread in the imperial robe, now tugged in a different direction. To resist, the Ottomans tried to reform. Mehmed II and the sultans after him launched the Tanzimat, an age of reordering. New laws were written, new ministries created, the postal system modernized, schools opened. Non-Muslims were promised equality before the law. Tax reform was introduced. Even the dress code changed. Turbans gave way to the fez, flowing robes replaced by tailored coats. The empire tried to become a nation among nations. But no law, however noble, can change the fear in a peasant's heart or the ambition in a governor's soul. Local leaders, once loyal, began to rule like kings. In Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, an Albanian officer in Ottoman service, took control. He reformed the army, taxed the land, built factories, and declared war on the very empire he served. His son led armies into Syria. At one point, it was not clear if the Sultan or his rebellious vassal would rule the empire. In the end, it was Britain and France that saved Istanbul. Not loyalty, not unity. The great European powers, fearing Russian dominance, propped up the empire like an aging actor, pushed onto the stage for one last scene. They gave loans, offered alliances, and whispered their own interests into the ears of Ottoman viziers. And so the empire remained standing. Not because it was strong, but because no one wanted it to fall into the wrong hands. But dignity faded. The Ottoman treasury, once full of silver and silk, sank into debt. Foreign advisors began to oversee state finances. Ports were leased. Railways built with foreign bonds. Telegraph lines connected cities to embassies more than to mosques. And all the while, the people endured. In the villages of Anatolia, life went on much as it had for centuries. Farmers tilled rocky soil, prayed 5 times a day, and sent their sons to die in wars they barely understood. In the alleys of Damascus and Cairo, traders haggled beneath carved wooden awnings. In Sarajevo, in Baghdad, in Aleppo, the empire still breathed, but its breath was heavy. The sultans tried to reach the people again. They built hospitals, sponsored newspapers, visited schools. They posed for photographs in military uniforms stitched in Paris. They gave speeches promising justice, faith, and strength. But the crowds were smaller now, and the eyes in those crowds held questions that could not be answered with ceremonies. In 1876, a new sultan was crowned, Abdulhamid II. He saw the danger clearly, and he tried to reverse it. He suspended the constitution, dissolved the parliament, ruled with a firm hand. He believed the empire could only survive under the old model. Absolute authority, guided by religion and loyalty. And for a time, It worked. He invested in infrastructure, education, and Islam. He promoted the idea of pan-Islamism, uniting all Muslims under the caliphate, rallying them against foreign encroachment. He sent envoys to India, to Central Asia, to North Africa. He built railways to Mecca. His image hung in mosques from Sudan to Sumatra. But repression came with revival. Dissent was crushed. Intellectuals fled. Newspapers were censored. Spy networks expanded. Trust eroded. And under the surface, revolution brewed. A group of reformists, civil servants, officers, students, formed the Young Turks. They believed the empire could only survive through constitutional rule, modernization, and secular government. Some were pious, others secular. Some wanted a Turkish state, others a multi-ethnic empire with new rules. But all agreed Abdülhamid had to go. In 1908 they rose. From barracks in Macedonia to coffee houses in Istanbul, the empire rumbled. Officers mutinied. Crowds marched. The Sultan, faced with a tidal wave, relented. He restored the constitution. The parliament was reopened. The people cheered. But it was too late. The empire was no longer a single story. It had become a library of grievances. And each book wanted its own shelf. The rot had not started with Abdülhamid, nor with Muhammad, nor even with Suleiman. It had begun with comfort, with pride, with the belief that an empire, once built, would last forever. But no tree lives only by remembering its roots. And now the Ottoman tree stood bare, limbed beneath a sky it no longer recognized. The wind blew harder. The soil thinned. And though the trunk still stood, its shadow no longer stretched as far. The fall was no longer unthinkable. It had become inevitable. Yet, even in this hour of twilight, the embers still glowed. And in some corners, even now, people still said, perhaps it could yet rise again. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a sea, it was a lake. Shrunken, shallow, restless. Its borders no longer held with pride, but with worry. The maps that once wrapped half the known world in the Sultan's toga now showed a wounded animal, retreating from the Balkans, from North Africa, from Arabia. The wounds bled slowly, each cut a reminder that even giants fall in stages. The empire's body was large, but its muscles were tired, its eyes heavy, and its mind pulled in 100 directions by a world that had become louder, faster, and more cruel than the one in which it had been born. After the revolution of 1908, the Young Turks had seized the reins of power, promising a new order. They restored the constitution, reinstated parliament, and chanted slogans of unity, reform, and modernization. For a flicker of time, it seemed as though the empire might awaken. Bleary-eyed, bruised, but breathing. But revolutions do not cure decay. They only rearrange its symptoms. The Young Turks, for all their idealism, were not unified. Some were secular, others devout. Some believed in pan-Ottomanism, holding the diverse empire together by shared law and shared hope. Others whispered of pan-Turkism, a new identity that would prioritize Turkish language and culture above all. In a state built on tolerance, the idea of hierarchy stirred fear. In the provinces, loyalty faltered. The Balkans erupted once more. In 1912, the First Balkan War broke out. A coalition of small states, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, Montenegro, rose together and shattered the Ottoman presence in Europe. Cities that had flown the crescent for centuries were lost in weeks. Monuments were smashed, mosques burned. Turkish families fled on foot, barefoot, hungry, whispering verses as they crossed into shrinking borders. One city after another, Skopje, Salonika, Monastir, was lost. In Istanbul, the news hit like thunder. The empire had not merely lost land, it had lost memory, history, poetry. It had lost the scent of its own past. The Second Balkan War came swiftly, as former allies turned on each other. The Ottomans seized back a few towns, but the damage was done. Europe was lost. The empire was now a Middle Eastern power, limping into a new century. Within, fear hardened into repression. The Young Turks tightened their grip. Newspapers were shut, dissenters jailed, secret police multiplied. A triumvirate of pashas, Enver, Talat, and Simul, rose to dominance, their ambition eclipsing their experience. They believed the empire could still be saved. But to save it, they believed it had to be remade. They looked outward and saw a world spiraling into fire. In 1914, the world's great powers marched to war. Britain, France, Russia, Germany. The Ottomans, isolated and uncertain, hesitated. Then they leapt. Aligning with Germany, they entered the Great War. The decision would define the end. The empire's enemies multiplied overnight. British troops landed in Basra. Russian armies pushed into eastern Anatolia. The French eyed the Levant. In Egypt, the British declared a protectorate, ending centuries of Ottoman rule with a single stroke. The war front was everywhere. On the snowy slopes of the Caucasus, thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze, ill, equipped and poorly led. In the Arabian deserts, revolts brewed, fueled by Arab nationalism and British gold. In Palestine, Ottoman soldiers defended railways with desperation, not confidence. In the Dardanelles, British and Anzac forces tried to storm Gallipoli and failed. Repelled by sheer Ottoman grit and the leadership of a young officer named Mustafa Kemal. The Gallipoli victory was a spark, but it could not light a soaked forest. In Anatolia, the government grew paranoid. Armenians, long integrated into Ottoman society, were now seen as potential traitors, accused of collaborating with the Russians. In 1915, under the fog of war, orders were issued. Deportations began. Villages emptied. Men were separated from their families. Caravans moved under the watch of soldiers. Many died from hunger, disease, or execution. The empire's conscience tore itself in half. What it once protected, it now feared. And what it feared, it destroyed. The Ottoman heart bled, not only from the wounds of war, but from the pain of what it had become. In the years that followed, the empire unraveled with speed no army could match. Jerusalem fell to the British in 1917. Damascus was taken in 1918. Baghdad had already been lost. Arab leaders, once loyal, now flew new flags. In Paris and London, diplomats drew lines through lands they had never seen, planning mandates and protectorates over the corpse of empire. On October 30, 1918, the Ottomans signed an armistice. The war was over, but the peace would be worse. Foreign troops occupied Istanbul. Allied warships sat in the Bosphorus, their guns pointed at the domes that once crowned the world. The Sultan remained on his throne, but now as a prisoner, a figurehead beneath a fading sky. The empire was alive in name only. The provinces were gone, the treasury empty, the railways seized, the people starved, millions dead, millions more displaced. The Ottoman world had collapsed, not in flames, but in exhaustion. And yet, in Anatolia, embers stirred. Mustafa Kemal, now hailed as a hero of Gallipoli, refused to accept defeat. He rallied what forces remained, not for the empire, but for a new beginning. He saw the sultans not as symbols of strength, but as relics of ruin, and he believed the future belonged not to palaces, but to the people. From Samsun to Ankara, a movement grew. Turks, betrayed and humiliated, rose under a new flag, no longer Ottoman, now national. They fought against occupying forces, British, French, Greek, Armenian. They fought for independence. They fought for survival. They fought not to restore the old world, but to build a new one on its ashes. And in 1922, they won. The Sultan, Mehmed VI, fled Istanbul aboard a British ship, exiled with no ceremony. The Caliphate, once the banner of Muslim unity, was abolished. The Ottoman Empire, after over 6 centuries, ended, not with a declaration, but with a quiet, irrevocable silence. But not all was lost. Its cities still stood. Its mosques still sang. Its architecture still reached for heaven. Its laws echoed in new codes. Its art survived in museums and memory. And its spirit lived on, not in empire, but in people. In Turkey, in the Balkans, in the Levant, in North Africa, the Ottoman legacy lingers like incense in old stone. Faint, persistent, unforgettable. The Ottomans did not vanish. They became part of history's bloodstream. Their roads are walked. Their songs still sung. Their calligraphy still read. Their shadows still stretch at dusk. For empires may fall, but the stories they leave behind are harder to erase. And the story of the Ottomans, vast and flawed, golden and tragic, remains one of the most haunting ever told. The ships came silently, like phantoms, across the Bosphorus. On the morning of November 13th, 1918, the people of Istanbul awoke to the sight of Allied warships gliding through the waters that once reflected the triumphs of sultans. The air was cold and heavy with the weight of what was now undeniable. The empire was no longer its own. One by one, the ships anchored. British flags, French banners, Italian ensigns waved in the sea breeze, mocking the once mighty crescent that now fluttered with shame above a city too proud to bow, too broken to resist. Their cannons pointed not at enemies abroad, but at the very heart of the Ottoman soul. Istanbul, the eternal capital, had become a prize on the victor's table. Foreign soldiers marched through the streets, once walked by Mehmed the Conqueror. They patrolled the gates of Topkapı Palace, passed beneath the archways of Hagia Sophia, lit cigarettes beside mosques whose minarets still sang the adhan. The rhythm of the city remained, but it was disfigured. The people moved like ghosts. Turkish women lowered their gaze. Old men held back tears. And children, too young to understand, played beneath flags they didn't recognize. In cafes, whispers filled the silence. Some still believed this occupation was temporary, that the Sultan would rise, that Allah would not allow such humiliation. Others knew better. They saw that the Sultan, Mehmed VI, sat like a puppet in his own palace, his power now confined to shadows and ceremonies. His signature meant little. His word meant less. The British watched him like a hawk. The French smiled politely. The Italians took what they pleased. The city was carved not with swords, but with contracts. Even the Ottoman banks, printing currency with the Sultan's seal, were now managed by foreign advisors. Each lira bore the echo of foreign footsteps. And yet, beyond the Bosphorus, something stirred. In Anatolia, across snow-covered fields and crumbling villages, the soul of the empire, no longer imperial, still breathed. Not as an institution, but as a people. The peasants, the veterans, the mullahs, the teachers, the forgotten and faithful. None had been asked whether the empire should die, but they were living its death in real time. The news of Istanbul's occupation rippled through the countryside like thunder rolling in the chest. One man watched it from a distance. Mustafa Kemal, once a general, now a name half forgotten, stood with his coat drawn tight, reading dispatches not from palaces, but from towns like Erzurum and Sivas. He understood something few in Istanbul did. The end had already happened. The question now was what would come next. Kemal believed the empire's fall was not a punishment, but an opportunity. He did not weep for the Sultan. He did not curse the caliphate. He saw that both had become hollow shells. He believed salvation would not descend from the heavens, but would be built with hands. Turkish hands, callosed and cold, but strong. In May 1919, he left Istanbul under the guise of a military inspection mission. His ship, the Bandroma, crossed the Black Sea under a sky swollen with rain. When he arrived in Samsun, the soil under his feet felt different. This was not the world of marble and chandeliers. It was mud, frost, fields, and firewood. It was real. From Samsun to Amasya, from Erzurum to Sivas, he walked and rode, met with tribal elders, officers, merchants, farmers. He spoke not of sultans or Sufi saints, but of sovereignty. The right of a people to live free, to govern themselves, to write their future not in Ottoman script, but in new ink. The people listened. Some with skepticism, others with hope. But in the ruins of empire, even a whisper of purpose was enough to ignite a forest. In July 1919, in Erzurum, the first Congress of Resistance met. Not under a dome, but in a school. Delegates wore threadbare coats and drank tea from chipped glasses. But their words carried thunder. They declared that no foreign power had the right to divide Anatolia. That no piece of land would be surrendered without a fight. That the people themselves were now sovereign. It was the first heartbeat of a republic still unborn. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the Sultan tried to maintain the illusion of control. He sent letters of protest to the Allies, signed documents with trembling hands, and watched from his palace windows as foreign parades marched through his capital. His ministers changed weekly. His supporters grew fewer. He had become a stranger in his own city. The press, though censored, reported on the resistance movement with cautious phrases. Rebels in the east, they said. Disturbances in Anatolia, but everyone knew what it was. A second empire was forming, not of territory, but of purpose. One that rejected the old titles, the old corruption, the old submission. In October 1920, war broke out again. But this was no war of empire. It was a war of rebirth. The Turkish national movement, led by Mustafa Kemal and his commanders, began pushing back against Greek forces in the west, Armenian armies in the east, and French occupiers in the south. It was brutal. It was improvised, but it was relentless. The Sultan, now irrelevant, watched silently as his empire was remade in front of him by men who no longer cared for thrones. And then, in November 1922, the decision came. The Turkish Grand National Assembly, now seated in Ankara, abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. There was no grand explosion, no riots in the streets. Just a quiet, final breath. The last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmed VA, climbed into a British warship at dawn. He wore a fez. His eyes were heavy. He carried only a small suitcase. As the ship pulled away from Istanbul, he looked back once, not at the city, but at the silhouette of a past that no longer belonged to him. 6 centuries of empire ended not in a blaze, but in retreat. But something strange happened. The city did not collapse. the people did not scream. The call to prayer still echoed. Children still ran down alleyways. The Bosphorus still shimmered. It was as if the soul of Istanbul had already prepared itself for the change. In its heart, the Ottoman Empire had died years before. The coronation of Sultan Selim in golden robes, the thunder of Suleiman's armies, the domes of Sinan, the verses of Baki, all of it was now memory. But memory is powerful, and though the Sultan was gone, though the crescent was pulled from official flags, the empire's story was not over. Because now it was becoming legend. Let me know when you're ready for segment 8, part 2, which will reflect on the final abolition of the caliphate, the spiritual and cultural aftermath, and the moment the Ottomans became history and myth. The ships came silently, like phantoms across the Bosphorus, on the morning of November 13th, 1918. The people of Istanbul awoke to the sight of Allied warships gliding through the waters that once reflected the triumphs of sultans. The air was cold and heavy with the weight of what was now undeniable. The empire was no longer its own. One by one, the ships anchored. British flags, French banners, Italian ensigns waved in the sea breeze, mocking the once mighty crescent that now fluttered with shame above a city too proud to bow, too broken to resist. Their cannons pointed not at enemies abroad, but at the very heart of the Ottoman soul. Istanbul, the eternal capital, had become a prize on the victor's table. Foreign soldiers marched through the streets, once walked by Mehmed the Conqueror. They patrolled the gates of Topkapı Palace, passed beneath the archways of Hagia Sophia, lit cigarettes beside mosques whose minarets still sang the Adhan. The rhythm of the city remained, but it was disfigured. The people moved like ghosts. Turkish women lowered their gaze. Old men held back tears, and children, too young to understand, played beneath flags they didn't recognize. In cafes, whispers filled the silence. Some still believed this occupation was temporary, that the Sultan would rise, that Allah would not allow such humiliation. Others knew better. They saw that the Sultan, Mehmed VI, sat like a puppet in his own palace. His power now confined to shadows and ceremonies. His signature meant little. His word meant less. The British watched him like a hawk. The French smiled politely. The Italians took what they pleased. The city was carved not with swords, but with contracts. Even the Ottoman banks, printing currency with the Sultan's seal, were now managed by foreign advisors. Each lira bore the echo of foreign footsteps. And yet, beyond the Bosphorus, something stirred. In Anatolia, across snow-covered fields and crumbling villages, the soul of the empire, no longer imperial, still breathed. Not as an institution, but as a people. The peasants, the veterans, the mullahs, the teachers, the forgotten and faithful. None had been asked whether the empire should die, but they were living its death in real time. The news of Istanbul's occupation rippled through the countryside, like thunder rolling in the chest. One man watched it from a distance. Mustafa Kemal, once a general, now a name half forgotten, stood with his coat drawn tight, reading dispatches not from palaces, but from towns like Erzurum and Sivas. He understood something few in Istanbul did. The end had already happened. The question now was what would come next. Kemal believed the empire's fall was not a punishment, but an opportunity. He did not weep for the Sultan. He did not curse the caliphate. He saw that both had become hollow shells. He believed salvation would not descend from the heavens, but would be built with hands. Turkish hands, calloused and cold, but strong. In May 1919, he left Istanbul under the guise of a military inspection mission. His ship, the Banderoma, crossed the Black Sea under a sky swollen with rain. When he arrived in Samsun, the soil under his feet felt different. This was not the world of marble and chandeliers. It was mud, frost, fields, and firewood. It was real. From Samsun to Amasya, from Erzurum to Sivas, he walked and rode, met with tribal elders, officers, merchants, farmers. He spoke not of sultans or Sufi saints, but of sovereignty. The right of a people to live free, to govern themselves, to write their future not in Ottoman script, but in new ink. The people listened. Some with skepticism, others with hope, but in the ruins of empire, even a whisper of purpose was enough to ignite a forest. In July 1919, in Erzurum, the first Congress of Resistance met. Not under a dome, but in a school. Delegates wore threadbare coats and drank tea from chipped glasses. But their words carried thunder. They declared that no foreign power had the right to divide Anatolia. That no piece of land would be surrendered without a fight. That the people themselves were now sovereign. It was the first heartbeat of a republic still unborn. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the Sultan tried to maintain the illusion of control. He sent letters of protest to the Allies, signed documents with trembling hands, and watched from his palace windows as foreign parades marched through his capital. His ministers changed weekly. His supporters grew fewer. He had become a stranger in his own city. The press, though censored, reported on the resistance movement with cautious phrases. Rebels in the east, they said. Disturbances in Anatolia. But everyone knew what it was. A second empire was forming, not of territory, but of purpose. One that rejected the old titles, the old corruption, the old submission. In October 1920, war broke out again. But this was no war of empire. It was a war of rebirth. The Turkish national movement, led by Mustafa Kemal and his commanders, began pushing back against Greek forces in the west, Armenian armies in the east, and French occupiers in the south. It was brutal, it was improvised, but it was relentless. The Sultan, now irrelevant, watched silently as his empire was remade in front of him by men who no longer cared for thrones. And then, in November 1922, the decision came. The Turkish Grand National Assembly, now seated in Ankara, abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. There was no grand explosion, no riots in the streets, just a quiet, final breath. The last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmed VA, climbed into a British warship at dawn. He wore a fez. His eyes were heavy. He carried only a small suitcase. As the ship pulled away from Istanbul, he looked back once, not at the city, but at the silhouette of a past that no longer belonged to him. 6 centuries of empire ended not in a blaze, but in retreat. But something strange happened. The city did not collapse. The people did not scream. The call to prayer still echoed. Children still ran down alleyways. The Bosphorus still shimmered. It was as if the soul of Istanbul had already prepared itself for the change. In its heart, the Ottoman Empire had died years before. The coronation of Sultan Selim in golden robes, the thunder of Suleiman's armies, the domes of Sinan, the verses of Baki, all of it was now memory. But memory is powerful. And though the Sultan was gone, though the crescent was pulled from official flags, the empire's story was not over, because now it was becoming legend. In the months that followed the Sultan's departure, Istanbul became something else. Neither capital nor colony, neither imperial nor republican. It was a city between worlds, between centuries. One foot in marble, the other in cement. The palace gates remained closed. The mosques still called to prayer, but fewer came. The markets reopened, but under new weights and new silence. And yet, above all the shifts in borders and banners, one final institution remained, a symbol untouched, a thread still tying the Islamic world together. The Caliphate. Even without a throne, without an army, without authority, the word caliph still held gravity. In villages from Morocco to Java, from Kashmir to Zanzibar, the caliph was not a politician. He was a figure of trust, of unity, of sacred memory. His name was recited in sermons. His presence marked a continuity with the Prophet. The Turkish Republic had abolished the Sultanate, but the Caliphate remained, stripped of political power, confined to ceremonial dignity, but still there. And that was the problem. For Mustafa Kemal and the architects of the new Turkey, the Caliphate was a bridge they no longer wanted to walk. They had severed ties with monarchy, feudalism, and foreign influence. But the Caliphate, despite its decay, remained a bridge to the past, to the Umayyads, to the Abbasids, to the Ottomans, to 1,000 years of empire wrapped in religion. To truly begin anew, that bridge had to burn. On the morning of March 3rd, 1924, the final decree was signed. The Caliphate was abolished, not challenged, not reformed, simply erased. Abdülmecid C, the last caliph, a man of poetry, art, and quiet dignity, was summoned. He was told he would leave immediately. He packed a small bag, no procession, no farewell. That night, he boarded a train to Switzerland with his family. No banners flew. No crowds gathered. 1,000-year-old institution vanished in the hush of bureaucracy. Across the Islamic world, the reaction was swift and fractured. In Cairo, scholars wept. In Delhi, protests erupted. In Damascus, sermons turned into lamentations. Across North Africa, in mosques built under Ottoman protection, imams hesitated. They paused before Friday prayers, unsure whether to mention a caliph who no longer reigned. For many, the idea of a Muslim world without a caliph was unthinkable. And yet, the silence held. No new caliph rose to take his place. No great scholar stepped forward with a sword or seal. The Arab world, divided by colonial lines, was not ready. The Indian subcontinent, still under British rule, had no platform. The Persian world had turned inward, and Turkey had turned its back. In Anatolia, Mustafa Kemal marched on. With the caliphate gone, he accelerated reforms. Religious courts were dismantled. The Arabic script was replaced by Latin letters. Islamic dress was discouraged. The fez was banned. The call to prayer was even translated into Turkish. Madrasa after madrasa was shuttered. Scholars were sidelined. The Diyanet, a state-controlled religious body, replaced centuries of independent ulema. Faith was not outlawed, but it was restrained, framed, caged. Islam remained in hearts, but no longer in institutions. For centuries, the Ottomans had balanced sword and prayer, mosque and state, sharia and canon. That balance, sometimes elegant, sometimes uneasy, had crumbled. In its place stood a secular republic, proud and forward, facing, determined never to return. But such a transformation leaves scars. In villages, elders sat in shock, watching young men abandon traditions. In towns, Quranic schools emptied. In homes, family names were changed. Arabic was forgotten. Ottoman Turkish faded like a ghost in the wind. A civilization once fluent in poetry, law, astronomy, and metaphysics was suddenly asked to begin again, from zero. And in Istanbul, the domes endured it all. Hagia Sophia remained, for now, a museum. The Sulaymani Mosque still stood. The Blue Mosque still lit its chandeliers each evening. But the people who entered did so not as citizens of empire, but as individuals, each holding memories no longer shared, no longer passed down. The Ottomans had once seen the world as layers, God above, creation below, and man in between, tasked with order and justice. Now, order was statistical, justice procedural, and God a private matter. For some, this was freedom. For others, it was exile without leaving home. But history does not wait for grief. The world moved on. Wars came. Empires fell elsewhere. New powers rose. In time, children born in the Republic grew up, never knowing the names of sultans, never hearing Ottoman Turkish, never reading the poetry of the palace, or the letters of distant provinces. And so, the Ottoman Empire faded, not with collapse, but with forgetting. Its glories became tourism. Its architecture became postcards. Its calligraphy, an art for collectors. Its music, recorded and archived. Its scholars, footnotes. Its sultans, exhibits in glass. But forgetting is not the same as erasure. In times of hardship across the Muslim world, many looked back. Not to colonizers, nor to the modern state, but to the memory of the Ottomans. A memory of dignity, of unity, of beauty wrapped in faith. Romanticized, perhaps. Incomplete, always. But powerful. For the Ottomans had once offered something rare. A civilization that tried, however imperfectly, to balance the eternal with the temporal. Today, their legacy survives not in politics, but in fragments. In Bosnia, minarets rise from snow-covered villages. In Cairo, Ottoman-era schools still carry whispers of ancient syllabi. In Palestine, roads built by pashas are still walked by those seeking freedom. In the call to prayer echoing through Sarajevo, in the domes of Skopje, in the ruins of Acre, and the libraries of Damascus, the Ottoman breath lingers. Not as a state, not even as a dream, but as a shadow, as a reminder, as a question. What does it mean to carry faith into power? What does it mean to fall not just politically, but spiritually? And what does it take to rise again? The Ottomans are gone, but in the silence they left behind, we still hear their voice. They say that when empires die, they do not vanish. They become stories. And the Ottoman Empire, more than any other, became a constellation of stories, scattered across time, across continents, across hearts. Its marble domes and winding bazaars may now live in museums, in photographs, in history books. But its echo travels further. It lingers in shadows, in sighs, in the silence between the Adhan and the wind. In Turkey, where its heart once beat loudest, the memory is complicated. The republic that rose from its ashes built its pride on forgetting. But forgetting is never clean. Even as new alphabets replaced old, even as secularism pulled the veil from the state, even as statues replaced calligraphy, something ancient remained. Old women still whispered Ottoman proverbs to their grandchildren. Old men still sat on wooden stools, sipping tea, the same way their fathers had under the gaze of sultans. No matter how modern the streets became, the soul of Istanbul still drifted in rhythms older than the tramlines. Elsewhere, the Ottoman ghost wore different faces. In the Balkans, it was nostalgia and resentment woven together. Churches once turned into mosques, now held both prayers and memories. In Sarajevo, a man could walk beneath a minaret designed by Sinan and remember the centuries when Ottoman governors ruled gently, when law was recited in both Arabic and Turkish, when the call to prayer echoed across mountains, not as conquest, but as presence. In Jerusalem, the legacy took on a sacred hue. The walls of Al-Aqsa still bore the seal of Ottoman sultans, who once guarded it with more than swords, with decrees, with gold, with diplomacy. The Haseki Sultan Minaret, built by Suleiman's wife, still served the poor centuries after its founders were dust. In the hearts of many Palestinians, the Ottomans were the last rulers who protected, not occupied, the Holy Land. In Mecca and Medina, where the Hijaz Railway once brought pilgrims from across the empire, the Ottomans were remembered not only for their rule, but for their service, for sending masons instead of merchants, for preserving the sanctity of the Haramain while the world around it turned to greed and colonial hunger. In Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, the empire had left contradictions. Some recalled it as distant and heavy-handed, others as a golden age of coexistence, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived under one law, where the ulama debated freely, and where poetry was spoken as easily as politics. Even in the farthest corners of the Old World, in the archipelagos of Southeast Asia, in the deserts of Sudan, in the bazaars of India, the Ottoman name carried weight, not of power, but of memory, a sense that once there had been a centre, a roof under which the Ummah gathered, however loosely, a symbol that the faith could rule and still nurture art, law, and dignity. But perhaps the deepest imprint was left on the soul. The Ottomans had understood something subtle, that greatness was not only measured by territory or armies, but by the architecture of meaning, by how a society lives, how it prays, how it marries the earthly to the eternal. Their mosques were not just places of prayer, they were cities within cities. Each complex held not only domes and carpets, but schools, kitchens, clinics, libraries, fountains. To enter one was to step into a world where God was not distant, but woven into water, stone, and silence. Their law was not perfect, but it was layered with conscience. Sultans, for all their might, were bound by Sharia and Qanon, and their judges could rule against them. The concept of justice was not just procedural, it was spiritual. To oppress a man was to risk the wrath of the Almighty. Their society, though stratified, held within it spaces for the scholar, the mystic, the artisan, the soldier, the merchant, the orphan, the stranger. The empire was vast not just in geography, but in imagination. Even their failures carried poetry. The fall of Constantinople was not just a siege. It was the fulfillment of prophecy. The rise of Suleiman was not just policy, it was fate. The Tanzimat reforms, though partial, were attempts to heal with pen instead of blade. Even the collapse, slow and aching, was treated with dignity, with sighs, not screams. This is why, long after the empire's body died, its ghost remained so vivid. Because the Ottomans did not merely govern. They meant something. And in a world increasingly empty of meaning, such memory becomes priceless. Today, young men in Tunisia wear Ottoman motifs on their shirts. In Pakistan, homes display old Tughra calligraphy. In Algeria, families tell stories of the day their ancestors fought beside Ottoman sailors against Spanish fleets. In Istanbul, tourists still weep in the Blue Mosque, even if they don't know why. The empire is no longer here. But it lives in gestures, in language, in silence, in the sound of leather shoes on stone steps at dawn, entering a mosque before sunrise, in the way an old tailor hums a forgotten melody from a vanished city, in the ink-stained fingers of a calligrapher drawing the name of Allah with a reed, just as they did 500 years ago. The Ottomans may not return, but perhaps they don't need to, because their empire was never just land. It was a world of meaning, a civilization of mercy, memory, and majesty, a bridge between heaven and earth. And though the bridge has collapsed, its stones still lie where the river runs, waiting perhaps for another people, another time, or simply to remind us that once we lived differently. And so the story ends, not with thunder, not with gunfire, but with a whisper that travels across centuries like the wind over ancient marble. The empire that once reached from the gates of Vienna to the shores of Aden, from the mountains of Bosnia to the sands of the Maghreb, now rests in memory. Its banners folded, its palaces dimmed, its voice quiet, but the silence is not empty. It is full of echoes. It is in this silence that we hear the empire most clearly. Not as conquerors, not as administrators, but as witnesses to time. The Ottomans did not just live in history. They became part of its bloodstream. They absorbed what came before them, added to it, and passed it forward, not in perfection, but in continuity. History rarely gives second chances, and the Ottomans, too, had their flaws. There were moments of cruelty, of corruption, of blind ambition. But woven between the flaws were centuries of patience, of purpose, of balance. A balance between law and love, between sword and scripture, between the weight of the world and the pull of paradise. They carried within them the burden of legacy, of Islam, of empire, of identity. And for a time, they bore it well. Now their cities are no longer capitals of empire. Their courts no longer echo with verdicts. Their armies no longer march. But in the soft blue light of dawn, when the call to prayer rises above a city they once ruled, something of them returns. Not in power, but in presence. There is a moment, a quiet moment, when you stand before the Blue Mosque, or beneath the arches of the Rustam Pasha, or in the golden library of the Topkat Palace. And you feel it, the breath of something larger than time, a trace of a people who believed that beauty itself was worship. That knowledge was sacred, that justice was a trust. This is what they leave behind, not borders, for borders are always redrawn, not treaties, for treaties are always broken, but a spiritual architecture, an ethic of care, a memory of civilization that held itself accountable, not to men alone, but to God. The Ottomans understood that empires are not measured by how many lands they take, but by how many lives they touch, how many hearts they warm, how many minds they awaken, how many prayers they carry. And so they built, not just buildings, but meanings. They built cities that welcomed strangers, markets where Christian, Jew, and Muslim traded beneath the same awnings, hammams where rich and poor shared the same water, courts where rulers could be summoned like any other man, mosques where silence spoke more than words, bridges that did not just cross rivers, but differences. Today, as the world forgets how to be whole, we look back, not to revive the empire, not to live in its shadow, but to learn, to remember that the past is not a place to return to, but a mirror to consult. In the Ottoman mirror, we see that faith and governance need not always clash, that justice can be beautiful, that power, when clothed in humility, can nurture rather than consume. And we see the cost of forgetting. For when the empire fell, a great many things fell with it. Not only titles and flags, but languages, sciences, traditions, dreams. The world grew louder, but not always wiser. Yet still, the Ottomans speak. They speak in the ruins and restorations, in the minarets that defy earthquakes, in the books that survive beneath dust, in the whispered dua of an old woman who still begins her morning the way her grandmother once did, facing the same Qibla. They speak through time, not as rulers, but as reminders. That civilization is not built in days. That mercy can be mightier than might. That art can be a form of prayer. That to serve the people is to serve the Creator. In the end, what is empire? Is it a crown, a castle, a name carved in stone, or is it something gentler, a way of being, a way of seeing? A moment when the world, however briefly, leaned toward justice, toward beauty, toward harmony. The Ottomans were not perfect, but they tried. And sometimes, trying is what matters most. We walk now without them. But we walk in paths they paved, drink from fountains they built, shelter beneath roofs they raised toward the sky. And when we bow our heads in the quiet of prayer, or the solitude of thought, they bow with us, not as ghosts, not as rulers, but as companions. For they are not gone, they are just waiting. In the wind that rustles an old courtyard, in the calligraphy that stretches across faded walls, in the hush of dawn, in the ink of history, and in the hearts that still remember